I remember the sound of breathing, not my own though mine was there too, shallow and measured behind the rebreather mask we wore in the lower detention blocks. No, I mean theirs, the prisoners. The way breath changes when a body begins to understand that hope is a luxury it can no longer afford. It becomes quick and desperate, or slow and defeated, or sometimes it stops altogether for long moments, as if the person has forgotten how, and then returns in a sudden gasp that echoes off the Durasteel walls. After enough years, you learn to read everything in those sounds. Fear, rue, defiance, the precise moment when resistance becomes something else entirely. I was an interrogator for the Galactic Empire for 11 years, 4 months, and 17 days. I remember the exact count because we logged everything every session, every technique authorization level, every chemical compound administered, every confession extracted and verified. The Empire was meticulous about documentation. They wanted records. They wanted proof that the system worked, that order could be maintained through procedure and protocol, that even the messy business of breaking human beings could be reduced to forms filed in triplicate and stored in databases that stretched across entire planets. My designation was at 7421. We didn't use names in the detention operations division. Names were for people who existed outside the machinery, who had lives that extended beyond their function. We had functions. We had designations. We had shift rotations and performance metrics and annual evaluations that measured our effectiveness by data points. I still see sometimes when I close my eyes. Confession rate, intelligence value rating, subject survival duration, information verification percentage. Numbers that represented hours spent in rooms where the air smelled like ozone and fear sweat, and the particular acrid scent of burned flesh that no amount of ventilation ever quite removed. I don't know when I stopped being a person and became it. 7,421. The transition was so gradual, I never noticed it happening. The recruitment was voluntary, in the way most things in the Empire were voluntary. I was 23 standard years old, fresh from service in the Imperial Security Bureau's Analytical Division, where I'd spent 2 years reviewing intelligence reports and flagging potential seditionists based on spending patterns, travel histories, and communication monitoring. It was clean work. Cerebral. I was good at finding patterns, at seeing the spaces between what people said and what they meant. My supervisor said I had an intuitive understanding of deception, which was apparently a valued skill. When the posting came through for advanced interrogation training, it was framed as a promotion. Better pay grade. Higher security, clearance, access to information that shaped policy at the sector level. They told us during the initial briefing that interrogators were the sharp edge of imperial justice, that we would be the ones who stood between order and chaos, who extracted the truths that kept billions of loyal citizens safe from terrorists and insurgents, and the scattered remnants of a failed republic that couldn't accept its own obsolescence. The instructor who gave that briefing was a tall woman with gray streaks in her hair and a voice like ice over Durasteel. She told us that the work would be difficult, that it would test us, that not everyone was suited for it, and there was no shame in requesting reassignment if we found ourselves unequal to the demands. But she also told us that we had been selected because the psychological profiles indicated we possessed the necessary combination of analytical intelligence, emotional stability, and commitment to imperial order. I remember feeling proud, chosen, necessary, the one. The training facility was on Coruscant, in a complex of buildings near the Imperial Palace that didn't appear on any public maps. We lived on site for 8 months. 43 students divided into training cohorts of 7 or 8. The compound had its own medical wing, its own dining facilities, its own recreation areas where we were encouraged to maintain physical fitness and foster camaraderie with our fellow trainees. Everything was gray, or black, or the deep red of Imperial insignia. Everything was monitored. We were told this was for our own protection, that the techniques we were learning made us targets for rebel sympathizers and would-be martyrs. The first month was all theory, psychology of resistance, pharmacological intervention, protocols, legal frameworks under Imperial law. New Dim Dao, Galactic Tribunal precedents for the treatment of detained persons, the physiological limits of various species, cultural taboos and their tactical applications. We sat in climate-controlled classrooms and took notes on datapads, while instructors walked us through case studies that had been sanitized of identifying details, but still made my hands shake the first few times. A suspected rebel courier who died from cardiac arrest during enhanced questioning. A Bothan information broker who maintained cover identity for 96 hours before chemical intervention produced cooperation. A former Republic official who provided location data for 17 resistance cells after targeted psychological pressure involving his family. They taught us that hesitation was a kindness to no one. That prolonging an interrogation beyond what was necessary created unnecessary suffering. That efficiency was a form of mercia. The faster we obtained intelligence, the faster the subject's ordeal ended. That reluctance to employ necessary techniques wasn't compassion, it was negligence. Because every hour we failed to extract actionable intelligence was another hour the enemies of the Empire had to kill loyal citizens, destroy infrastructure, spread chaos. They taught us that what we felt didn't matter. That personal distaste or emotional reaction was a weakness to be identified and overcome. That we were instruments of justice, and instruments didn't indulge in sentiment. The practical training began in the second month. They brought in subjects H. I remember, that's the word they used. Never prisoners, never people, just subjects An, who had already been convicted of capital crimes under Imperial law. Treason, sedition, terrorism, armed resistance. We were told they had exhausted all appeals and were scheduled for execution anyway. That by participating in training exercises, they were at least serving the Empire in their final days, contributing to the development of interrogators who would protect innocent lives. I don't know if I believed that even then, but I told myself I did. The rooms were smaller than I'd expected, 3 meters by 4 meters maybe. Durasteel walls, seamless and soundproofed. A single drain in the floor that could handle liquids and was designed to be easily sanitized. Restraint systems that could be configured for any of dozens of species' anatomies. Lighting that could be adjusted from blinding white to near total darkness. The temperature controls were precise to 1/10 of a degree. The air recyclers were so efficient you could barely hear them. Just a whisper quiet hum that became white noise after a few minutes. And the chair. Always the chair, though its configuration varied. Sometimes just a simple seat with wrist and ankle restraints. Sometimes something more elaborate, neural disruptor arrays, chemical injection ports, stress position maintenance systems, sensory deprivation apparatus. The chair was always in the center of the room. Everything else the interrogator station, the monitoring equipment, the medical override controls. Faced it. My first practical session was with a human male, middle-aged, convicted of conspiracy to destroy Imperial food distribution infrastructure on Corellia. The supervising instructor walked me through the preliminary protocol, verify subject identity, explain the legal framework of the interrogation, clarify that cooperation would be noted in final records, establish baseline psychological and physiological responses through preliminary questioning. The man was already restrained when I entered. He looked at me, and I remember his eyes were brown and very tired. He didn't say anything, didn't plead or threaten or spit curses like subjects did in the training holovids. He just sat there, breathing, watching me with those exhausted brown eyes while I went through the script I'd memorized. The instructor's voice came through my earpiece, calm and professional, telling me to begin with level 1 psychological pressure, isolation emphasis, consequence clarification, authority reinforcement. I did what I'd been taught. Well, I explained that his cooperation was inevitable, that the question was only how much suffering he would endure before reaching that inevitability, that his family had already been detained pending investigation of their knowledge of his crimes. That last part wasn't true. The instructor fed me the line, told me to watch for reaction. The man's breathing changed, got faster. His hands tightened against the restraints. Level 2, the instructor said in my ear. Activate discomfort. Setting 1. There was a control panel built into my station, elegantly designed, color-coded. I pressed the indicated button. The chair emitted a high-frequency sound, inaudible to human hearing, but psychologically distressing awe. Something about the way it resonated with inner ear structures created subclinical vertigo and nausea. The man's face went pale. He swallowed hard. "My family," he said, and his voice was hoarse, like he'd been screaming before I arrived, though I knew he hadn't. "My family had nothing to do with Level 3, the instructor said. I don't remember what level 3 was. I've tried to forget the specifics, but they come back anyway, usually at night, usually in pieces. Electrical stimulation, I think. Low grade, carefully calibrated to cause pain without tissue damage. The man made a sound I'd never heard before, something between a gasp and a sob. The session lasted 40 minutes. By the end, the man had confirmed his involvement in the conspiracy, provided the names of 7 other participants, and given detailed information about their meeting locations and communication protocols. The instructor was pleased with my performance. Said I maintained proper professional detachment. "Bro," said my technique application was precise and appropriate to the resistance level. Demonstrated. I vomited in my quarters that night, quietly, into the refresher, where no one could hear. By the 3rd month, I didn't vomit anymore. The work became routine. That's the word that comes closest to describing what happened, though it doesn't quite capture the nature of the transformation. Routine suggests boredom, mechanical repetition, the mind wandering while the body performs familiar tasks. But this was different. This was a careful, deliberate shutting down of everything that would interfere with function. The instructors called it professional adaptation. They monitored us for signs of excessive stress or emotional compromise, but they also monitored us for insufficient adaptation, for students who couldn't make the transition from moral certainty to operational necessity. 3 members of my cohort were reassigned during training. I know. One requested transfer after his 2nd practical session. Another had what the medical staff called an acute stress reaction during a level 5 interrogation and refused to continue. The 3rd simply disappeared between one day and the next, and when we asked about him, we were told he'd been transferred to another division and that we should focus on our own development. I passed every evaluation. No, my confession rate was above average. My intelligence verification scores were consistently high. I learned to modulate my voice to maximize psychological impact, to read microexpressions that indicated a subject was approaching breaking point, to calculate the precise dosage of chemical agents based on species, body mass, and current stress levels. I learned which techniques worked best on different psychological profiles: ideological zealots versus opportunistic criminals, trained intelligence operatives versus civilian sympathizers, hardened soldiers versus soft targets. I learned to use the word targets without flinching. Graduation was a small ceremony in a windowless conference room. 12 of us remained from the original 43. We received our designations, our duty station assignments, our security clearances, our authorization levels for various interrogation techniques. A senior officer whose face I can no longer recall gave a brief speech about the importance of our role in maintaining Imperial order, about the lives we would save through the intelligence we extracted. about the necessity of setting aside personal sentiment in service of the greater good. We swore an oath. I don't remember the words anymore, but I remember the feeling the sense of having committed myself to something larger and more important than my individual conscience, of having accepted a burden that others lacked the strength to carry. I was assigned to Detention Center Gamma 9, a maximum security facility in orbit around Scarif. The center served the entire Outer Rim sector, processing high-value detainees captured by Imperial Security Bureau field operations. The facility held approximately 300 subjects at any given time, rotated through based on intelligence value and interrogation priority. We had a staff of 27 interrogators working in rotating shifts, supported by medical personnel, security officers, administrative staff, and specialized technicians who maintained the equipment. My quarters were a small room with a bunk, a locker, a desk with a datapad terminal, and a narrow viewport that looked out at the stars. I kept the viewport covered most of the time. The vast emptiness of space felt too much like the emptiness I was learning to cultivate inside myself. The work was constant. 3 or 4 interrogation sessions per day, each lasting anywhere from 30 minutes to 6 hours depending on subject, resistance, and intelligence value. Between sessions, there were briefings with ESB handlers, reports to file, technique authorization requests to submit for subjects, requiring enhanced protocols, medical consultations to ensure subjects remained viable for continued questioning. We had weekly performance reviews, monthly psychological evaluations to screen for burnout, compassion fatigue, or inappropriate emotional attachment to subjects or outcomes. Quarterly skill assessments, where senior interrogators observed our sessions and provided feedback on technique application, information extraction efficiency, and professional demeanor. The facility ran on strict protocols. Subjects were designated by processing numbers, never names. We received only the information necessary for interrogation focus on suspected crimes, known associations, intelligence requirements. We weren't told about their families, their histories, the circumstances that led to their detention. That information was deemed irrelevant to operational requirements and potentially compromising to interrogator objectivity. The subjects arrived in the detention center in batches, usually after major SB operations or security sweeps. They came from everywhere: core worlds and outer rim territories, corporate sectors and frontier colonies, worlds so loyal to the Empire, they bled Imperial red and worlds that had to be pacified with orbital bombardment. They were humans and Twi'leks and Bothans and Duros and Mon Calamari and dozens of other species. They were young and old, soldiers and civilians, true believers and opportunists, heroes and cowards. They all looked the same after the first hour. I interrogated my first subject at Gamma 9 on my second day. A Rhodian male, detained during a raid on a suspected rebel safe house on Rhodia. Processing: number D701734. Age: approximately 30 standard years. Suspected of providing logistical support to rebel cells operating in the Savarine sector. Intelligence requirement: identify other safe houses, confirm rebel command structure, verify supply routes. The session was routine. Level 2. Psychological pressure escalating to Level 4 physical stress when initial resistance persisted. Subject cooperated after 90 minutes, provided names and locations that were flagged for verification. Survival duration: viable for continued interrogation. Intelligence value: moderate. Report filed. Authorization for follow-up session granted. I ate lunch in the facility cafeteria after that. Processed protein, recycled water, nutrient supplements. The other interrogators at my table talked about shift rotations and equipment maintenance requests, and whether the new sedative compound was as effective as the pharmaceutical division claimed. Someone made a dry joke about a subject who tried to bargain for mercy by offering intelligence about his employer's tax evasion. We all laughed. I don't remember feeling anything wrong about that. The routine continued. Hey! Days became weeks, became months. I settled into the rhythm of the work. The careful choreography of each interrogation. Enter the room, verify subject identity, establish baseline responses, apply calibrated pressure, extract intelligence, document results, exit the room. Each session was a problem to be solved, a puzzle of pressure and resistance, psychology and physiology, patience and precision. The subjects blurred together. Different faces, different species, different crimes, but the same essential pattern. Defiance, then fear, then negotiation, then collapse, then collapse, then cooperation. Some broke quickly. Others held out for hours or days. A few never broke at all. Their bodies failed before their resistance did, or their psychological conditioning was too deep, or something in their fundamental nature made them choose death over betrayal. Those were the difficult ones. Not because they generated emotional response, I'd learned to suppress that, to treat their deaths as operational failures rather than moral events, but because they represented inefficiency. A dead subject was intelligence lost, questions unanswered, networks uncompromised. We were supposed to keep them alive, keep them useful, extract every fragment of information before their value was exhausted. The medical staff helped with that. They were skilled at maintaining subjects in states of viability, at repairing damage without allowing recovery, at calculating the precise limits of what a body could endure. They used Bacta for injuries that would prevent continued interrogation, administered nutrient supplements to subjects who'd stopped eating, provided cardiac stabilizers when extreme stress threatened system failure. They were professionals, like us. They understood that their role was to extend the interrogation window, not to heal. I worked with the same medical technician for most of my sessions, a quiet human woman designated MT 3390. She never spoke except to provide clinical updates. Subject's cardiovascular system is approaching stress threshold, recommend de-escalation, or neurological responses indicate effective technique application, safe to continue. She had steady hands and empty eyes, and I sometimes wondered what her story was, how she'd ended up in this place doing this work. But we didn't ask each other personal questions. We didn't build friendships or share histories. We were designations, functions, components in the machinery of Imperial Order. The isolation was absolute, but also strangely comforting. I had colleagues, but no friends. We worked together, ate together, attended the same briefings and performance reviews, but we maintained careful distance from anything that might be called intimacy. Some of the interrogators had relationships with each other, or with other facility staff. I would see them in corridors, talking in low voices, or notice the way they looked at each other in the cafeteria. But most of us kept to ourselves, wrapped in the professional detachment that made the work possible. I sent occasional messages to my family on Corlag, brief and carefully worded. I was assigned to classified security work in the Outer Rim. I was well. I hoped they were well. I couldn't provide details about my duties. My messages were reviewed by facility security before transmission, and their responses were reviewed before I received them, and eventually the correspondence dwindled to nothing. They stopped asking questions about my work. I stopped inventing acceptable answers. We became strangers connected by genetic chance and fading memory. The work continued. 6 months into my assignment, the Empire completed construction of the Death Star. We heard about it through official channels. A new strategic asset, a symbol of Imperial power, the ultimate guarantor of order throughout the galaxy. The announcement was accompanied by images of the battle station, vast and terrible and beautiful in its geometric perfection. We were told it had been tested successfully against a target that had refused to accept Imperial authority. They didn't mention the target by name in the initial announcement, but the intelligence came through eventually. Alderaan. An entire planet. Billions of people. Gone in an instant, reduced to debris and radiation and empty space, where a world had been. Some of the newer interrogators seemed shaken by the news. I overheard conversations in the cafeteria, questions about whether such an action had been necessary, whether the strategic value justified the cost. Those conversations stopped quickly. Questioning imperial policy wasn't encouraged, and public displays of doubt could lead to psychological evaluation, reassignment, or worse. I didn't feel shaken. No, I felt validated in a strange way. The Death Star was just a larger version of what we did in the interrogation rooms, the application of overwhelming force to break resistance and extract compliance. The scale was different, but the principle was the same. The Empire maintained order through the threat and application of power. We, interrogators, broke individuals. The Death Star broke planets. It was all part of the same system, the same necessary mechanism of control. That thought should have disturbed me. I understand that now. But at the time, it just seemed logical, consistent, the natural extension of everything I'd been taught and everything I'd practiced. The subjects we processed in the months after Alderaan were different, though. More resigned. More broken before we even began. The destruction of an entire planet had accomplished what 1,000 interrogations couldn't. It had communicated the absolute futility of resistance. Our sessions became shorter. Cooperation came faster. The intelligence flowed freely, because what was the point of withholding information when the Empire had demonstrated it could erase worlds? I should have recognized the pattern. No, should have seen that the same mechanism was operating on us, the interrogators, as operated on our subjects. We were being broken to incrementally, session by session, report by report, oath by oath. Our resistance, the resistance of our conscience, our empathy, our fundamental human dignity, was being systematically dismantled and replaced with efficiency metrics and authorization levels, and the certainty that what we did was necessary. But I didn't see it, or I saw it and accepted it as the price of the work, or I saw it and was too tired to care. The second year was harder than the first, though I wouldn't have admitted that at the time. The work itself became easier. My technique improved, my confession rates increased, my evaluations were consistently superior. But something inside me started to deteriorate in ways I couldn't quite identify. Sleep became difficult. I would lie in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, and the emptiness I'd cultivated would fill with unwanted memories. Faces I'd tried not to see, sounds I'd tried not to hear, the particular way a body trembled when pain exceeded the capacity for conscious control. The medical staff offered medication, sleep aids, anxiolytic compounds, neural suppressants that dampened emotional response. Many of the interrogators used them. I refused initially. I told myself I didn't need chemical assistance to manage my psychological state. But after a particularly difficult series of sessions involving a Twi'lek family unit accused of harboring rebel sympathizers, I requested a prescription. The medication helped. It smoothed out the rough edges, filled in the gaps where disturbing thoughts kept emerging. I slept better. The intrusive memories became less frequent. I functioned more efficiently. My performance reviews improved. Looking back, I realized the medication was another part of the machinery, another mechanism of control. The Empire didn't want interrogators who struggled with moral uncertainty or psychological distress. They wanted functional units, consistent output, reliable performance. If chemistry could optimize that outcome, then chemistry was prescribed, monitored, titrated for maximum effect. We were all being interrogated, in a way. Our own beliefs, our own humanity, subjected to systematic pressure until we broke and confessed that we were nothing but instruments serving a greater purpose. The facility processed thousands of subjects during my time there. I personally interrogated 473 detainees across 11 years. Most provided actionable intelligence. Most survived their interrogations, at least initially. What happened to them after they were transferred to permanent detention or processing for execution wasn't my concern. Some died during, or shortly after, interrogation, cardiovascular failure, cerebral hemorrhage, adverse reaction to chemical compounds. Occasionally, suicide, though the restraint systems were designed to prevent that whenever possible. I filed reports on all of them. Detailed documentation of techniques applied, intelligence extracted, subject status at session conclusion. The reports went into databases that fed operational planning, strategic assessment, resource allocation. My work mattered. The intelligence I extracted contributed to the capture of rebel cells, the disruption of supply networks, the identification of sympathizers and collaborators. People died because of the information I obtained, but other people, loyal Imperial citizens, presumably lived because of that same information. I told myself that equation balanced. That the mathematics of necessity justified the methodology. That individual suffering was an acceptable cost when measured against collective security. I believed that. I had to believe it because the alternative was unbearable. The third year brought new technology. Enhanced neural mapping systems that could identify memory patterns associated with deception. Targeted pharmaceutical agents that suppressed higher reasoning while leaving information recall intact. Sensory stimulus arrays that could generate psychological distress without physical trauma, reducing visible damage and simplifying subject maintenance. We received training on the new systems. The sessions were shorter, more efficient, less physically demanding on both subjects and interrogators. The confession rates increased. The intelligence value ratings improved. The performance metrics trended positive across all measured parameters. The work became cleaner. More clinical. The room smelled less like fear and burned flesh, more like antiseptic and ozone. The sounds changed to less screaming, more subdued moaning and the hum of electronic equipment. Progress, the facility director called it. Evolution of interrogation methodology toward optimal efficiency with minimized resource expenditure. But the subjects still broke. They still cooperated. They still betrayed everything they'd believed in, everyone they'd loved, every principle they'd held sacred. The technology just made it happen faster, with less mess, with more reliable documentation. I don't know when I stopped sleeping well again. The medication dosage kept increasing, the medical staff said. I was developing tolerance, that higher concentrations were necessary to maintain therapeutic effect. But even with the medication, I would wake in the middle of the night cycle, my quarters dark and silent except for the ever-present hum of the station's systems, and I would lie there feeling like something inside me had been scraped hollow and replaced with machinery. The fourth year, the fifth year, the sixth year, they blend together in memory. Different subjects, different intelligence requirements, different operational priorities, but the same essential routine. Enter the room. Why? Verify identity. Apply pressure. Extract intelligence. Document results. Exit the room. Now, I exit the room. The pattern repeated so many times it became automatic, required no conscious thought, no emotional engagement, no acknowledgement that the person in the chair was anything more than a problem to be solved. I became very good at solving problems. My designation was known throughout the detention operations division. I was requested for high-value interrogations, difficult subjects, time-sensitive intelligence requirements. I trained newer interrogators, passed along the techniques that had proven most effective, modeled the professional detachment that made the work sustainable. I received commendations. My security clearance was upgraded. My compensation increased. I was a success by every metric the Empire used to measure success. And I was empty. Completely, utterly empty. Not in the way I'd been taught to cultivate professional detachment, that had been a deliberate suppression of emotion, a choice to prioritize function over feeling. This was different. This was absence. A void where something essential had been carved out and never replaced. I started making mistakes. Small ones at first. Forgetting to file reports on time. Confusing subject processing numbers. Losing focus during sessions. Having to check my notes to remember what intelligence requirements I was supposed to address. The mistakes were minor enough that they didn't trigger formal concern, but I noticed them. And I noticed the effort it took to maintain the facade of competence. The conscious strain of performing tasks that had once been automatic. The 7th year, a Mon Calamari female was brought to the facility. Processing number, D12,847. Suspected of coordinating rebel naval operations in the Calamari sector. High-value target. Priority intelligence requirement. Fleet positions, command structure, operational planning. She was resistant. Even with enhanced pharmaceutical protocols and level 6 physical stress techniques, she maintained operational silence. 30 hours of interrogation across multiple sessions. No actionable intelligence. Her physiology was deteriorating. The medical staff warned that continued questioning at current intensity would result in system failure within 12 hours. I was authorized to proceed with level 7 interrogation, techniques reserved for extreme circumstances, carrying significant risk of permanent damage or death, but justified by intelligence value. The authorization came directly from ESB Sector Command. They needed the information. They needed it immediately. The subject's survival was secondary to intelligence acquisition. I prepared the room, configured the systems, reviewed the protocols. Everything was ready. The subject was brought in and secured. I began the session, and I looked at her face. I don't know why that moment was different from the thousands before it. I'd looked at subjects' faces throughout my career, had learned to read their expressions for tactical information, had watched fear and pain and despair play across features of every species the Empire had cataloged. But something about this particular face, this particular moment, penetrated the emptiness inside me. She wasn't afraid. That's what I noticed first. Every subject was afraid, at some level, even the ones who tried to hide it. Fear was biological, autonomic, beyond conscious control. But this Mon Calamari female looked at me with something else in her large, dark eyes. Not defiance exactly. Not contempt. Something more like pity. She pitied me, and I realized in that moment that she saw something I'd been refusing to see for years. She understood what I'd become, what this work had made me, and she felt sorry for me in a way she probably didn't feel sorry for herself. I stood there, my hand on the control panel, authorized to proceed with techniques that would almost certainly kill her, and I felt something crack inside the void. Not guilt, I was too far gone for simple guilt. But a kind of horror. A sudden, visceral recognition of what I'd allowed myself to become. I proceeded anyway, because I'd been trained to proceed, because the authorization had been granted, because the intelligence was necessary, because stopping would raise questions I couldn't answer, because I didn't know how to be anything other than at 7,421 anymore. The session lasted 6 hours. The subject died 40 minutes before the time limit expired, her cardiovascular system failing under extreme stress. She never provided the intelligence we needed. The mission was classified as a failure. My performance review noted the unsuccessful outcome, but acknowledged that I had followed proper protocols and that subject expiration was within acceptable parameters given the authorization level. I filed my report. I returned to my quarters. I lay on my bunk and stared at the ceiling and felt absolutely nothing. 3 days later, I requested psychological evaluation. The facility counselor was a human male, middle-aged, with the tired eyes of someone who'd spent too long helping interrogators manage the consequences of their work. He asked me standard questions about sleep patterns, medication compliance, stress indicators, emotional state. I answered honestly, which was probably my first mistake in years. I told him about the emptiness. About the mistakes. About the moment when I'd looked at the Mon Calamari's face and felt something crack inside me. About how I couldn't remember what it felt like to care about anything beyond performance metrics and intelligence value ratings. He listened, took notes on his data pad, asked follow-up questions. Then he told me I was experiencing advanced compassion, fatigue with markers of dissociative psychological adaptation. He said it was common among long-term interrogation personnel. He adjusted my medication, added a new anxiolytic compound, and recommended I take a week of administrative leave to achieve psychological stabilization. He also flagged my file for ongoing monitoring. I saw the notation when I reviewed my personnel records later. Potential compromise to operational reliability. Monitor for escalation. I took the leave. Spent 7 days in my quarters, taking the new medication, trying to sleep, trying to feel something other than the vast emptiness. The medication helped, in the way medication always helped. It smoothed everything out, made the emptiness feel normal, acceptable, sustainable. I returned to duty, resumed my rotation. Processed subjects, filed reports. The work continued, but something had changed. Or maybe something had finally broken that couldn't be repaired by medication or professional protocols or the weight of all those authorization forms and intelligence requirements and performance metrics. I started noticing things I'd trained myself not to notice. The way subjects' hands shook when they were first secured. The particular sound of labored breathing through damaged airways. The smell of fierce sweat and the sharper smell of evacuated bowels when stress triggered autonomic responses. The way eyes that had held defiance or dignity or hope became dull and empty, just like mine. I started seeing the faces in my dreams, even with the medication. Not the faces of specific subjects, Those had all blurred together into a composite image of suffering that had no individual identity, but a generic face that wore every expression of pain and fear and despair I'd witnessed, staring at me with those same pitying eyes the Mon Calamari female had had. The 8th year was worse. My performance began to slip noticeably. Confession rates dropped below optimal range. Intelligence verification showed increased error rates. Session durations extended beyond efficiency parameters. Medical staff reported concerning levels of subject damage requiring intervention. My evaluations shifted from superior to acceptable to concerning. I was reassigned from high-value interrogations to routine processing. Lower priority subjects. Less complex intelligence requirements. Cases where unsuccessful interrogation carried fewer operational consequences. It was a demotion, though it wasn't called that officially. Temporary reallocation to support operational workload distribution. The reassignment order said. I knew what it meant. I was compromised. No longer reliable. Being monitored for further deterioration before a final determination about my continued utility. The routine processing was almost worse than the high-value work. At least with important subjects, there was a sense of necessity, of the intelligence mattering enough to justify the methodology. But routine processing was just grinding through bulk interrogations of minor offenders, people whose crimes were petty enough that their intelligence had minimal value. We interrogated them anyway. Broke them anyway. Extracted their small, pathetic secrets about neighbors who spoke against the Empire or co-workers who shared rebel propaganda, or family members who hadn't reported suspicious activity. The Empire wanted all the information. Every fragment, every betrayal. Not because most of it mattered strategically, but because the act of extraction itself mattered, because fear needed to be universal, because resistance needed to be impossible, because everyone needed to understand that nothing they knew, nothing they loved, nothing they believed would be protected if the Empire decided otherwise. We were instruments of that understanding. Or you are. And I'd finally begun to understand what that meant. The 9th year, 10th year, 11th year crawled past. I functioned. Showed up for shifts, processed subjects, filed reports. The medication dosages kept increasing. The evaluations stabilized at acceptable with reservations. I was no longer marked for promotion or high-level work, but I wasn't dismissed either. The Empire had invested resources in my training. I was still functional enough to be useful. They would extract whatever utility remained before discarding me. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was being processed just like the subjects in the chairs, systematically drained of everything that made me human until only the useful parts remained. I stopped sending messages to my family entirely, stopped maintaining my quarters beyond basic sanitation requirements, stopped eating in the cafeteria with other personnel. I requested shift assignments during sleep cycles, when fewer people were working, when I could move through the facility's corridors without having to perform the facade of normal interaction. I became a ghost. Present, but not present. Functioning, but not alive. The subjects noticed. Some of them would look at me during sessions, and I could see them recognizing that I was as trapped as they were, as broken, as hopeless. That recognition should have made them more cooperative, eh? What was the point of resisting someone who was already destroyed? But sometimes it made them more resistant, as if they refused to give anything to someone who'd already given away everything that mattered. I didn't care either way. Their resistance or cooperation was data points, nothing more. The intelligence was extracted, or it wasn't. The reports were filed either way. The machinery continued operating, grinding through subjects and interrogators alike with the same indifferent efficiency. Then the news came through official channels. The Death Star had been destroyed. Rebel attack dot. Now, impossible targeting. Catastrophic loss of personnel and strategic capability. The Emperor's apprentice, Lord Vader himself, had barely escaped. The facility went into security lockdown immediately. Enhanced protocols. Increased interrogation tempo. Every subject with suspected rebel connections was subjected to aggressive intelligence extraction, focused on Rebel Alliance leadership, base locations, operational plans. The Empire needed to respond decisively, to demonstrate that even a strategic loss wouldn't weaken its grip on the galaxy. The interrogators worked double shifts, triple shifts, sustained by stimulant medications and the driving pressure of operational urgency. I was back on priority assignments, The facility needed every functional interrogator, and my recent performance issues were apparently less important than immediate intelligence requirements. I processed 17 subjects in 3 days, extracted intelligence from 12 of them. 5 died during or shortly after interrogation. My reports were perfunctory, bare minimum detail, but adequate for operational purposes. No one cared about my technique or psychological state, or whether I was maintaining proper professional protocols. They just needed results, needed them immediately, needed to feed the massive intelligence operation, trying to locate and destroy the Rebel Alliance before it could capitalize on its victory. The Death Star's destruction changed something fundamental in the Empire's psychology, though I don't think anyone acknowledged it directly. There was a kind of panic beneath the official pronouncements of Imperial strength and inevitable retaliation. The battle station had been the ultimate symbol of control. If a single rebel attack could destroy it, then maybe the Empire wasn't invincible after all. Maybe resistance wasn't futile. Maybe there was hope. We saw that hope reflected in the subjects. Even under extreme interrogation, even when their bodies were breaking and their minds were fragmenting, there was something different in their eyes. A defiance that hadn't been there before Alderaan, a refusal to accept the inevitability of Imperial victory. They still broke, still cooperated, still betrayed their comrades and their cause. But it took longer, required more pressure, left less of them intact afterward. The Empire's response was predictable: increase the pressure, expand authorization levels, process more subjects more aggressively, root out every rebel sympathizer, every potential resistance node, every fragment of hope that might metastasize into organized opposition. The facility's detention capacity was exceeded within weeks. Subjects were held in temporary processing areas, sometimes restrained in corridors while waiting for interrogation slots. The medical staff couldn't keep up with the volume of damage requiring intervention. The morgue facilities were overwhelmed. The entire system strained under the operational tempo, and the strain showed in ways the Empire's carefully maintained facade usually prevented. I watched interrogators I'd worked with for years begin to crack. One simply stopped showing up for shifts, locked himself in his quarters, refused to respond to summons. Security had to force entry. They found him catatonic, unresponsive to external stimuli. His mind retreated to some place where the work couldn't reach him. He was transferred to a psychiatric facility on Coruscant. Another interrogator, designation at 9201, executed a subject during a routine session 8 not as part of authorized technique application, but deliberately, methodically, using interrogation equipment to kill someone who had already been cooperating. When questioned, he said he was being merciful, that killing them quickly was kinder than letting them survive with what we'd done to them, with what they'd betrayed, with the knowledge of their own broken compliance. He was court-martialed, convicted of destruction of Imperial assets, and executed himself. The message was clear. Our role was extraction, not judgment. We were tools, and tools didn't make independent decisions about the value or fate of subjects. But at 9201 had seen something the rest of us were still trying to ignore. That maybe death was mercy, compared to survival with the weight of interrogation-induced betrayal. That maybe we were creating something worse than martyrs. We were creating hollowed-out people who would carry their shame and their broken compliance back into whatever remained of their lives, spreading the poison of their cooperation through every relationship, every community, every attempt to rebuild what the Empire had torn down. We weren't just extracting intelligence, we were destroying the capacity for resistance itself, person by person, betrayal by betrayal, until the entire galaxy understood that loyalty to anything except the Empire would only result in suffering and self-inflicted destruction. I understood that, finally. Understood it in a way that made the emptiness inside me feel almost comforting, because the alternative was confronting the full horror of what I'd participated in for 11 years. The 12th month after the Death Star's destruction, I was assigned to interrogate a human female, young, maybe 20 standard years. Processing number D18993, captured during an Imperial raid on a suspected rebel recruitment operation on Chandrilla. No previous arrest record. No identified connections to known rebel cells. Suspected of distributing anti-Imperial literature and encouraging Imperial citizens to consider resistance. Low-value subject. D. Routine processing. The kind of assignment that barely registered as significant. She was terrified when they brought her in, shaking so hard the restraints rattled, crying before I even began preliminary questioning. She kept saying she hadn't done anything wrong, that she'd just shared some messages she'd seen on the holonet, that she didn't know they were illegal, that she was loyal to the Empire and would never support terrorists. Standard fear response. Standard denial. I went through the protocols mechanically, verified her identity, explained the legal framework, clarified that cooperation would be noted in her file, started preliminary questioning to establish baseline responses. She cooperated immediately. Didn't even require pressure escalation. No. Just answered every question, provided names of everyone she'd contacted, described the content of every message she'd shared, offered details about communication methods and distribution networks. She was so eager to help, so desperate to prove her loyalty, so convinced that if she just told us everything we wanted to know, she could go home and resume her life. I documented her cooperation, noted the intelligence value minimal, mostly confirmation of information already in the system, flagged several names for follow-up investigation, completed the session in under an hour. She thanked me when I was finished. Actually thanked me, her voice hoarse from crying, saying she was grateful I'd given her a chance to explain, that she understood the Empire was just trying to protect people, that she would never make the same mistake again. I told her that her cooperation would be noted. I didn't tell her that her future processing was outside my scope of responsibility. Didn't tell her that she would likely be transferred to a labor detail or permanent detention facility. Didn't tell her that everyone she'd named would be arrested and interrogated. Didn't tell her that her cooperation had just destroyed her entire social network and marked her as a collaborator who could never be trusted by either side. I just filed my report and moved on to the next subject. But her face stayed with me. The desperate gratitude in her eyes. The naive belief that cooperation would save her. Now, the terrible misunderstanding of what the machinery did to people, even compliant people, even people who wanted nothing more than to serve the Empire and be allowed to live their small, harmless lives. She was a perfect subject, gave us everything we wanted without resistance, created no complications, required no special techniques, cost the Empire nothing in time or resources. By every operational metric, the interrogation was a success, and I realized I couldn't remember a single time in 11 years when I'd felt worse about a session. Not the resistant subjects who died under extreme interrogation, not the ideological zealots who chose suffering over betrayal, not the hardened operatives who maintained operational silence despite everything we did to them, the ones who fought back, who made us work for every fragment of intelligence, who maintained some measure of dignity even in their breaking. Those at least had agency, had chosen resistance knowing the cost. But this girl, she'd been ground up by the machinery without ever understanding what was happening to her. She'd cooperated completely, and it hadn't saved her. She'd betrayed everyone she knew, and it hadn't mattered. She'd offered everything, and it had been taken as the minimum expected compliance, nothing more. That was what the Empire did, not just to the resistant, but to everyone. It extracted compliance and called it loyalty. It manufactured betrayal and called it cooperation. It destroyed people and called it order. And I had been an instrument of that destruction for 11 years, 4 months, and 17 days. I submitted a formal request for reassignment that night. Cited accumulated stress, performance degradation, medical concerns. Requested transfer to administrative duties, analytical work, anything that didn't involve direct subject contact. The request was denied. My particular skill set was considered necessary for current operational requirements. I was prescribed additional medication, required to attend weekly psychological counseling, and assigned to modified duty schedule with reduced session load. The counselor, a different one this time, was more direct than his predecessor. He told me that many long-term interrogators experienced what I was experiencing. That the work took a toll that no amount of training or professional protocols could fully mitigate. I said that the Empire understood this and made accommodations when possible, but that operational necessities sometimes required personnel to continue functioning beyond their comfort range. He asked me if I understood my duty. I said I did. He asked me if I intended to continue fulfilling that duty. I said I would. I would. What else could I say? I'd given 11 years to this work. I'd hollowed myself out in service of Imperial order. I'd committed acts that no amount of rehabilitation or redemption could erase. I was at 7,421, and that designation was all I had left. Without it, I was just a broken thing with nothing to justify its existence. The modified schedule helped, marginally. Fewer sessions per week. Longer intervals between interrogations. More time alone in my quarters, taking medication, staring at walls, trying to remember what it felt like to be a person instead of a function. I started reviewing my old reports. Thousands of them, stored in the facility database. Subject after subject, interrogation after interrogation, each one documented in clinical language that stripped away everything human and left only data points and intelligence assessments and operational outcomes. I read through my first-year reports and barely recognized myself in the precise professional language. That version of it, 7,421, had been certain. Committed. No. Committed. Convinced that the work mattered, that the intelligence extracted justified the methodology, that serving the Empire was the highest purpose an individual could achieve. I read through my later reports and saw the language becoming more perfunctory, more mechanical, less engaged. The same phrases repeated across hundreds of sessions. The same assessments. The same recommendations. Copy, paste, modify processing number, and specific intelligence details, file and move to next subject. I had become a machine for converting human beings into data, and the data had become so routine, I'd stopped seeing the people at all. Except I was seeing them now. All of them. Every face I'd tried not to look at. Every voice I'd trained myself not to hear. Every person I'd broken and documented and processed out of my consciousness. They were all there in the reports, reduced to processing numbers and intelligence value ratings and technique authorization levels, but still present, still real, still the evidence of what I'd done. 473 people. Some had died. Some had survived. All had been fundamentally altered by their time in the interrogation rooms. And I had altered them, methodically, professionally, with proper authorization and appropriate documentation and careful attention to operational protocols. I had followed every rule, met every standard, fulfilled every requirement. And in doing so, I had participated in something monstrous. The recognition didn't bring catharsis or redemption. It just made the emptiness heavier, filled it with the accumulated weight of all those sessions, all those reports, all those faces I could no longer pretend not to see. The facility continued its operations. Other interrogators processed subjects. Intelligence flowed upward to ASB command, fed operational planning, contributed to the Empire's ongoing campaign against the Rebel Alliance. The machinery kept functioning, with or without my full participation. I continued my modified schedule, showed up for assigned sessions. Applied appropriate techniques, extracted required intelligence, filed adequate reports. I was functional enough to be useful, broken enough to be controllable, and experienced enough to be retained despite my obvious psychological degradation. The perfect Imperial asset, really. Completely dependent on the system that was destroying me, unable to imagine existence outside the structure that gave me purpose, loyal through sheer absence of alternatives. The months dragged on. Routine returned, or the simulation of routine. The enhanced operational tempo following the Death Star's destruction gradually normalized. The facility's detention population stabilized at manageable levels. The pressure to process subjects at unsustainable rates decreased. The Empire's machinery adjusted to the new reality of an ongoing insurgency, rather than a threat that could be quickly eliminated. And I kept working. What else was there? I was approaching 12 years of service when the facility received an unusual directive from ESB Sector Command. All interrogation personnel with 10 or more years of continuous duty were to undergo comprehensive psychological evaluation and medical assessment. The stated purpose was to identify burnout risk and optimize personnel allocation. The unstated purpose was obvious. The Empire wanted to determine which of its long-term interrogators were still reliable and which had degraded beyond acceptable operational standards. The evaluation took 3 days. Extensive interviews, cognitive assessments, physiological monitoring, medication review, analysis of performance metrics, and session recordings. They were thorough. They wanted complete understanding of our psychological state, our reliability, our continued utility to the Empire. I answered their questions honestly. Described the emptiness, the intrusive memories, the difficulty maintaining detachment, the accumulated weight of the work. I didn't try to hide my deterioration or perform false competence. What was the point? They could see the truth in my performance records, in my medication history, in the way my hands shook slightly when I filled out the assessment forms. The evaluation officer was a senior ESB psychologist, a woman who'd probably assessed hundreds of interrogators over the years. She reviewed my results with the same clinical detachment I'd once applied to subjects, told me my cognitive function remained adequate, but showed signs of trauma-related impairment, that my emotional regulation was severely compromised, despite medication, that my identification with subject suffering indicated potentially problematic empathy development. She asked me if I wanted to continue interrogation work. I told her I didn't know what else I could do. Well, she made a note on her datapad, and I saw something almost like pity flicker across her face. Then it was gone, replaced by professional neutrality. 2 weeks later, I received my reassignment orders. I was being transferred to the Imperial Security Bureau's Data Analysis Division on Coruscant. My interrogation authorization was revoked. My security clearance was reduced to standard level. My service record was flagged with a notation I wasn't allowed to see, but which would presumably follow me throughout any remaining Imperial career. I was done. Me. After 11 years, 4 months, and 17 days, I was no longer an interrogator. I should have felt relieved. I wanted out, wanted escape from the rooms and the subjects, and the relentless pressure to extract intelligence from human beings. But I didn't feel relieved. I felt nothing. Just the same emptiness, now without even the structure of the work to give it shape. The data analysis assignment was administrative punishment, disguised as compassionate reassignment. I would spend my days reviewing intelligence reports filed by other interrogators, cross-referencing information, identifying patterns, flagging inconsistencies. I would see the results of interrogations without having to perform them. I would remain connected to the machinery without being one of its primary instruments. I processed out of detention center, Gamma 9, 3 weeks later, packed my minimal belongings. Signed transfer documentation. I said goodbye to no one, because there was no one to say goodbye to. The other interrogators were colleagues, not friends. We'd shared work, but not connection. My departure was just another personnel rotation, administratively routine, operationally insignificant. I took one last walk through the facility before leaving. Through the administrative sections, the medical wing, the security checkpoints. I stood outside the detention block entrance, sealed doors that led to the interrogation rooms where I'd spent so much of my life. I could hear it through the soundproofing, just barely. The hum of recycled air, the distant, muffled sounds of sessions in progress. The breathing that changed when hope died. And I understood finally that I hadn't been interrogating subjects for 11 years. I'd been interrogating myself. Every session had been a test of how much humanity I could surrender, how much emptiness I could tolerate, how completely I could transform myself into an empire's will. I'd passed every test, met every standard. I'd become exactly what they wanted me to become. And in doing so, I'd lost everything that made the transformation worth surviving. The transport to Coruscant was commercial, not military. I sat among civilians, people living ordinary lives, going about ordinary business, untouched by what happened in places like Gamma 9. They laughed and complained about minor inconveniences, and talked about weather and sports and things that mattered in their small, normal worlds. I watched them, and felt like I was seeing a species I no longer belonged to. They had no idea what the Empire did to maintain the order that allowed them their comfortable complaints. They didn't know about the detention centers, the interrogation rooms, the systematic breaking of anyone who questioned Imperial authority. They lived in the carefully constructed illusion that power was benevolent, that compliance was natural, that the Empire protected them rather than controlled them. Maybe they were right not to know. Maybe the only way to live normally in the Empire was to accept that illusion, to never look too closely at the machinery that ground up dissidents and insurgents and inconvenient people, and converted them into intelligence reports and operational victories. Maybe I'd made a mistake by seeing what the work really was, what it cost, what it made of the people who performed it. The data analysis position was everything the interrogation work wasn't. Clean? Well, distant. Abstracted. No. I sat in a small office in an anonymous ESB building, reviewing reports on a datapad, flagging correlations between different intelligence sources, building profiles of suspected rebel networks based on information extracted in interrogation sessions across the sector. I saw my own report sometimes, filed by it 7,421 before my reassignment. They look different from this distance, just text on a screen, professional documentation of professional interrogations. The subjects were processing numbers. No. The techniques were authorization levels. The suffering was resistance indicators and cooperation thresholds, and physical stress responses. All the language designed to obscure what actually happened. All the clinical terminology that made torture sound like methodology. All the bureaucratic frameworks that transformed human destruction into data analysis. I was good at the analytical work. My performance reviews were satisfactory. I showed up on time, processed my assigned reports, identified relevant patterns, filed appropriate flagging notifications. I was functional, useful, a small component in the vast intelligence apparatus that fed the Empire's security operations. I was also dead, not physically. My body continued its biological processes, maintained by adequate nutrition and medication, and the minimum exercise necessary for health maintenance. But everything that had made me a person was gone, carved out by years of interrogation work and never replaced by anything, except protocol and procedure and the vast crushing weight of what I'd done. The other analysts didn't talk to me much. I think they could sense the deadness, the absence where normal human connection should be. Or maybe they'd seen my personnel file, knew I was a decommissioned interrogator, understood what that meant. Either way, I worked in isolation even when surrounded by colleagues. The isolation was fine. I didn't want connection. Didn't want to contaminate anyone else with what I'd become. Didn't want to pretend I was capable of normal interaction when everything inside me was machinery and emptiness, and the accumulated ghosts of 473 faces. The medication continued. Higher doses now. Multiple compounds designed to manage what the medical staff called post-traumatic adjustment syndrome with dissociative features. The medication kept me functional, kept the intrusive memories at bay, kept the emptiness from expanding into complete psychological collapse. I wondered sometimes if the Empire was just prolonging my utility, squeezing out whatever remaining value I had before inevitable disposal, or if they genuinely believed I could be maintained indefinitely, kept functioning through chemistry and routine and the absence of alternative options. I wondered if it mattered which one was true. The rebellion grew stronger over the following years. I saw it in the intelligence reports, in the increasing sophistication of their operations, in the expansion of their networks. The Death Star's destruction had emboldened resistance across the galaxy. More people were willing to risk Imperial reprisal. More systems were providing tacit support to rebel cells. More intelligence operations were required to track and counter the growing insurgency, which meant more interrogations. More detention centers. More subjects processed through the machinery I'd been part of. More interrogators recruited and trained and gradually hollowed out by the work. The cycle continued. The Empire maintained order through fear and force, and the systematic breaking of resistance. The rebellion fought back, motivated by hope and desperation, and the refusal to accept imperial dominion. And people like me, the interrogators, the analysts, the functionaries who kept the machinery operating, continued processing human beings into data points that fed the endless conflict. I spent 3 years in the data analysis position. 3 years of reviewing reports, building profiles, identifying patterns. 3 years of seeing the results of interrogations without having to perform them. 3 years of trying to maintain the minimum functionality necessary for employment, while the medication barely kept pace with the deterioration. Then the news came through official channels. The Emperor was dead. Vader was dead. The second Death Star had been destroyed. The Empire had suffered catastrophic leadership failure at the Battle of Endor. The SB building went into security lockdown. Emergency protocols activated. Enhanced vetting of all personnel for loyalty verification. The machinery scrambled to maintain cohesion in the face of existential threat to Imperial authority. I sat in my office, reviewing the fragmentary intelligence reports, watching the Empire begin its collapse in real-time documentation. And I felt something crack inside the emptiness. Not hope, I was too far gone for hope. But a kind of grim recognition. The machinery that had created me, that had shaped me into an instrument of its will, that had carved out everything human and replaced it with protocol and procedure that machinery was failing. Which meant everything I'd done, everything I'd sacrificed, everything I'd become it had been in service of a system that couldn't even maintain its own existence. The Empire fractured over the following months. Warlords carved out territories. Loyalist forces fought desperate, holding actions. The rebellion became the new republic and began establishing legitimate governance. The galaxy descended into chaos as the rigid order that had defined it for decades collapsed into competing power structures and ideological conflict. The ASB dissolved. Or rather, it fragmented into dozens of successor organizations, serving different imperial remnants, different warlords, different visions of what the Empire should have been. My office closed. My position was eliminated. My employment with Imperial Intelligence ended with an impersonal notification, and severance compensation calculated based on years of service. I was discharged after 15 years of Imperial service. 11 as an interrogator, 3 as an analyst, 1 in the chaos of collapse. They gave me credits, a civilian identification card, and no explanation of what I was supposed to do with the rest of my life. I had no family to return to. The people I'd once been related to were strangers who'd stopped responding to my messages years ago. I had no friends, no connections, no relationships that extended beyond functional collaboration with other Imperial personnel. I had no skills applicable to civilian life, no training that didn't involve extracting information from unwilling subjects or analyzing intelligence reports. I had nothing except the emptiness and the medication, and the accumulated weight of 473 faces. I ended up on Nar Shaddaa, because that's where people go when they have nowhere else to go. The smuggler's moon, where the Empire's reach had always been weak, and the New Republic's authority was barely established, where you could disappear into the crowds and the vertical cityscape and the chemical haze of 1,000 vices. I found cheap quarters in a section of the moon where no one asked questions. Took day labor when I needed credits loading cargo, cleaning industrial equipment, the kind of work that required no thought and no identity. Took my medication when I could afford it. Went without when I couldn't. Now, the intrusive memories got worse without consistent medication. The faces came back, more vivid than before. I would wake in my quarters, the sounds of Nar Shaddah's endless activity filtering through the walls, and remember specific sessions. Specific subject. The particular sound someone made when level 4 techniques were applied. The way hands trembled against restraints. The expression in eyes that had given up on mercy, but still held some terrible, useless hope. I started visiting cantinas, not for social interaction, but for the noise. The crowds and music and constant motion helped drown out the memories, or at least made them less overwhelming. I would sit in corners, nursing cheap alcohol, watching the flow of people who had lives and purposes and reasons to exist. I saw other Imperial veterans sometimes. You could recognize them even when they tried to blend in awe, something in the posture, the way they scanned environments, the particular kind of damage in their eyes. Some were trying to integrate into civilian life. Others were waiting for whichever Imperial remnant would pay them to go back to the work they knew. None of them were interrogators. Or if they were, they didn't advertise it. That particular specialty was even less marketable than most Imperial skills. Soldiers could become guards or mercenaries. Pilots could fly transports. Technicians could maintain equipment. But interrogators? There was no civilian application for what we'd learned. No legitimate employment for people whose primary skill was systematically breaking human beings. I lived like that for 2 years. Day labor, cheap quarters, medication when possible, cantinas when the memories became too loud, existing without purpose, functioning without life, sustained by nothing except the biological imperative to continue, and the absence of courage to stop. I thought about stopping sometimes. Nar Shaddaa made it easy. There were 1,000 ways to die on the smuggler's moon, most of them quick, some of them even painless. But I never followed through. Maybe because suicide felt like a decision, and I'd lost the capacity for decisions somewhere in the interrogation rooms. Maybe because even death seemed like more than I deserved. Maybe because the emptiness was so complete that even the prospect of ending it couldn't generate enough motivation to act. So, I continued. Waking, working, medicating, sleeping. The cycle repeated, without variation or meaning. The galaxy rebuilt itself around me. The new republic established governance structures. Former Imperial territories were integrated or abandoned. The war crimes tribunals began processing senior Imperial officials. The galaxy moved forward, while I remained frozen in the moment I'd looked at a Mon Calamari female and felt something crack inside me. Then, 3 years after the Empire's collapse, I saw something in a cantina that changed everything. It was just a holovid broadcast, playing on screens throughout the establishment. A new Republic tribunal announcement. They were expanding their war crimes investigations, specifically targeting personnel involved in detention and interrogation operations. They'd recovered databases from Imperial facilities, including Detention Center Gamma 9. They had records, names, designations, reports. They were looking for interrogators. The announcement included a list of individuals already identified and wanted for trial. My civilian name wasn't on it. I'd changed that when I received my discharge documentation. But its 7,421 was listed. Wanted for crimes against sentient beings. Multiple counts. High priority apprehension. I sat in that cantina, watching my designation scroll across the screen, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Fear. No. Not the clinical fear I'd witnessed in subjects. Not the abstract fear of professional consequences, but pure, visceral, animal fear. The kind that contracts your chest and accelerates your heartbeat, and makes you want to run without knowing where you're running to. Because I understood what the tribunals meant. They were going to expose everything. All the reports I'd filed, all the sessions I'd performed, all the techniques I'd applied. They were going to document it publicly, make it part of official record, ensure that the galaxy understood what had been done in the Empire's name, and they were going to hold people accountable. Interrogators, supervisors, commanding officers, everyone involved in the machinery. They were going to put us on trial, force us to confront what we'd done, make us answer for the suffering we'd inflicted. The tribunals weren't about revenge, according to the announcement. They were about truth, about justice, about ensuring that the galaxy never forgot what the Empire had been, what it had done, what it had made of the people who served it. I left the cantina and returned to my quarters. Locked the door, sat on the narrow bunk, and tried to think through the fear. I could run. Nar Shaddaa was a good place to disappear, but there were better ones. Outer Rim worlds where the New Republic's authority was barely theoretical. Criminal enclaves where no one cared about war crimes tribunals. I had some credits saved. I could vanish completely, become someone else. Let it 7,421, remain a name on a wanted list that would never be connected to whoever I became next. Or I could turn myself in. Now, Antian Tuitar. The thought emerged from the emptiness like something alien. Turn myself in. Face the tribunal. Das. Answer for what I'd done. Accept whatever consequences the New Republic deemed appropriate for 11 years of systematic torture in service of Imperial order. I didn't know which option was more terrifying. I spent 3 days in my quarters, not sleeping, barely eating, just sitting with the decision. The fear gradually gave way to something else. Not courage, I had no courage left, but a kind of exhausted recognition that running would just extend the emptiness, prolong the half-life I'd been living since the Empire fell. At least the tribunal would be an ending. One way or another, it would finish the story that had started when I'd volunteered for interrogation training 15 years ago. On the 4th day, I went to the New Republic Embassy on Nar Shaddaa, told them I was at 7,421, formerly an Imperial Interrogator assigned to Detention Center Gamma 9, I told them I was surrendering voluntarily. They arrested me immediately, placed me in detention, pending transfer to the tribunal facility on Chandrilla. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was now a subject, processed through the machinery of justice, waiting in a cell for interrogation of a different kind. The cell was small but not uncomfortable. Ngatu Kari. Better than my quarters on Nar Shaddaa, actually. Clean. Temperature controlled. Regular meals. Medical attention, including continuation of my medication. The New Republic was scrupulous about treating detainees humanely, even when those detainees were accused of systematic torture. Especially then, maybe. They wanted to demonstrate the difference between their justice and Imperial order. Wanted to prove that accountability didn't require cruelty, that truth could be extracted through process rather than pain. I wondered if that would work. If the other interrogators facing trial would cooperate with tribunals that couldn't compel them the way we'd compelled our subjects. If the simple threat of legal consequences would be sufficient to overcome trained resistance and professional loyalty to the fallen empire. Then, I realized I didn't care. Let them resist or cooperate, lie or tell the truth. It didn't matter anymore. The machinery had finished grinding me down. There was nothing left to protect, no loyalty to maintain, no identity to preserve except the designation that had replaced my name. The tribunal began 6 months after my surrender. They'd spent that time reviewing records, interviewing witnesses, building cases against the interrogators they'd apprehended. I was one of 37 facing trial for war crimes committed at Detention Center Gamma 9. The proceedings were public. Broadcast across the New Republic, documented for historical record, open to anyone who wanted to watch the Empire's interrogators answer for their work. The courtroom was large, designed to accommodate not just legal personnel, but also survivors of imperial detention, journalists, historians, and ordinary citizens who wanted to witness justice being served. I sat with the other accused interrogators, all of us wearing standard detention uniforms, all of us facing the tribunal judges and the assembled witnesses. Some of my former colleagues looked defiant. Others looked resigned. A few looked as empty as I felt. The prosecution presented their case methodically. They had our reports, our session recordings, our performance evaluations. They had testimony from subjects who'd survived Gamma 9, who described what we'd done to them, how we'd broken them, what it had cost them. They had expert witnesses who explained the techniques we'd used, the physical and psychological damage they inflicted, the systematic nature of the torture program. They built a comprehensive picture of what detention center Gamma 9 had been, an industrial-scale torture facility, processing thousands of subjects, extracting intelligence through methodical application of pain and psychological pressure, operated by trained professionals who understood exactly what they were doing and chose to do it anyway. When it was my turn to testify, the prosecutor asked me to explain my role. I told them everything, not because I was seeking mercy or hoping for leniency. Why? Not because I thought confession would absolve me or mitigate my guilt, but because I'd spent 15 years documenting every session, filing every report, maintaining meticulous records of exactly what I'd done. The truth was already in evidence. Lying or resisting would just prolong the process. I described my training, my assignments, my techniques. I confirmed the accuracy of the reports filed under my designation. I acknowledged that I had interrogated 473 subjects, that some had died during or after interrogation, that I had applied every level of enhanced techniques up to and including those that carried significant risk of permanent damage or death. The prosecutor asked me if I believed what I'd done was justified. I told them I used to believe it was necessary, that I'd been taught to see myself as an instrument of imperial justice, that the intelligence I extracted protected loyal citizens, that individual suffering was acceptable when measured against collective security. I told them I didn't know what I believed anymore, that the certainties I'd operated under had collapsed along with the Empire, that I understood now what I'd refused to see during my years as an interrogator, that I'd participated in systematic torture, that no amount of intelligence value or operational necessity could justify what we'd done to human beings in those rooms. But I also told them I didn't know if understanding changed anything, that I'd acted with full knowledge and conscious choice, that my training had explained exactly what we would be doing, and I'd accepted it anyway, that I couldn't claim I'd been deceived or coerced or acting under duress. I'd volunteered. I'd continued. I'd excelled at the work. I was guilty. By any measure, by any standard, I was guilty of the crimes I was accused of. The tribunal judges listened, took notes, asked clarifying questions. They were professional, thorough, neither cruel nor kind, just focused on establishing truth, documenting the facts, ensuring that the record would be complete. The trial lasted 3 months. Testimony from interrogators, survivors, expert witnesses, document review, session recordings, medical evidence. The tribunal reconstructed what detention center Gamma 9 had been, how it had operated, what it had done to the thousands of people processed through its facilities. The survivors' testimony was the worst part. Hearing people describe what we'd done to them, how it had affected them, what they'd lost. Some spoke with anger. No. Others with pain. A few with a kind of resigned sadness, as if they'd accepted that what had been done couldn't be undone, and were just trying to ensure it was acknowledged. One of them was the young human female I'd interrogated near the end of my time at Gamma 9, processing number D18, 1993. She'd survived, though she described how her cooperation had resulted in the arrest of everyone she'd named, how she'd been marked as a collaborator, how she'd spent years in labor detention before the Empire's collapse. She testified about her interrogation. How terrified she'd been, how desperately she'd wanted to cooperate, to prove her loyalty, to make the Empire understand she wasn't a threat. How grateful she'd been when I'd told her that her cooperation would be noted, believing it meant mercy, protection, a chance to resume her life. She testified about what happened instead. The labor camp do. The years of grinding work and minimal rations and constant fear. The knowledge that everyone she'd known had been arrested because she'd given their names. The survivor's guilt that came from having cooperated so completely and gained nothing except continued survival. She looked at me while she testified. Her eyes held the same naive hope they'd had in the interrogation room, though now it was directed at the tribunal, at the justice system, at the idea that truth and accountability might somehow balance the equation of what had been done to her. I couldn't look away, couldn't hide behind professional detachment or clinical language, or the emptiness that had sustained me for years. I had to sit there and watch her describe what I'd done, what it had cost her, what she'd lost. And when she finished, when the prosecutor had no more questions, and she was dismissed, she thanked the tribunal. Thanked them for listening, for caring, for trying to make things right. She still believed that cooperation led somewhere, that telling the truth mattered. That the system would protect her if she just gave it what it wanted. I had broken her so thoroughly that she couldn't conceive of another way to exist. The tribunal deliberated for 2 weeks after the testimony concluded. Then, they reconvened the court to deliver their verdict and sentencing. Guilty. All 37 of us. Multiple counts of crimes against sentient beings. Torture. Unlawful detention. Murder in cases where subjects had died during interrogation. Conspiracy to commit systematic violations of sentient rights. The sentences varied based on individual circumstances. Some of the interrogators who'd cooperated extensively, who'd shown remorse, who'd served shorter periods, received 15 to 20 years detention. Others received life sentences. 3 were sentenced to execution. Interrogators who'd killed subjects outside of authorized protocols, who'd demonstrated particular cruelty, who'd shown no recognition of wrongdoing. My sentence was 30 years detention, with possibility of conditional release after 20. The tribunal acknowledged my voluntary surrender and cooperation with the investigation. They also noted the extent of my crimes, the number of victims, the duration of my service, and what they called my systematic participation in an institutional torture program with full knowledge and professional expertise. 30 years. I was 41 years old. If I served the full sentence, I would be 71 when released. If I achieved conditional release, 61. Either way, the majority of my remaining life would be spent in detention, paying the debt the tribunal had calculated I owed for 11 years of interrogation work. The mathematics felt appropriate. Inadequate, but appropriate. No amount of detention could restore what I'd taken from 473 people. No amount of punishment could undo the suffering I'd inflicted. But at least there would be consequence. At least the galaxy would know that what we'd done had been acknowledged, documented, and judged unacceptable. I was transferred to a new Republic correctional facility on Chandrilla, the same planet where I'd interrogated that young woman so many years ago. Another irony in a story full of them. The facility was nothing like Detention Center Gamma 9. No interrogation rooms. No restraint systems. No carefully calibrated instruments for inflicting pain. Just cells in common areas and work assignments in therapeutic programs designed to rehabilitate prisoners rather than break them. I was assigned to a rehabilitation unit for former Imperial personnel convicted of war crimes. We were separated from the general prison population, partly for our own safety, partly because the New Republic believed we required specialized programming to address the particular psychological damage caused by our former work. The therapeutic sessions were mandatory. Weekly, individual counseling. Twice weekly. group sessions with other former interrogators, monthly psychiatric evaluations. The goal was to help us develop what the counselors called moral reintegration, the capacity to recognize the harm we'd caused, accept responsibility for our actions, and rebuild some measure of ethical framework that could sustain us through long sentences. I participated without resistance, answered the counselors' questions, engaged in the group discussions. I took the medications they prescribed when my old prescriptions proved inadequate for the prison environment. I was a model prisoner, compliant and cooperative, causing no disruptions or difficulties, just like I'd been a model interrogator. Compliant and cooperative, following protocols, meeting standards. The counselors said I was making progress, that I was developing insight into my actions, that I was beginning to process the trauma, both the trauma I'd inflicted and the trauma I'd experienced as an instrument of systematic torture. I didn't tell them that I wasn't processing anything. That I was just performing cooperation the way I'd learned to perform professional detachment. That the emptiness inside me hadn't changed, hadn't healed, hadn't been filled by therapy or medication, or the passage of time. I didn't tell them that every night, in the privacy of my cell, I still saw those faces, still heard that breathing, still remembered the particular sound a body made when hope died. The other former interrogators in my unit dealt with their sentences in different ways. Some maintained that they'd been following orders, serving the Empire, doing their duty as they'd been trained. They were angry at the New Republic for prosecuting them, bitter about being held accountable for work that had once earned them commendations and promotions. Others had collapsed into guilt and self-recrimination. They spoke about their victims constantly, listing names and faces and specific interrogations that haunted them. They engaged desperately with the therapeutic programs, seeking some path to redemption or forgiveness, or at least the ability to live with what they'd done. A few had gone silent. They moved through the prison routines mechanically, spoke only when required, showed no emotional response to therapy or group sessions or anything else. They'd retreated so far inside themselves that nothing external could reach them anymore. I understood all of them, the angry ones, the guilty ones, the silent ones. We were all just variations on the same theme, all people who'd been instruments of imperial torture, who'd had to live with what that meant after the Empire fell, who were now serving sentences that could never balance the equation of harm we'd caused. The years passed slowly. The rehabilitation programs continued. The counselors documented our progress or lack thereof. The facility operated on carefully maintained schedules that gave structure to the formless time of long sentences. I received occasional messages from survivors who'd testified at the tribunal. Some wanted to confront me again, to make sure I understood what I'd done to them. Others wanted to tell me they'd forgiven me, that they'd found peace, that they hoped I could find peace too. A few just wanted me to know they were still alive, still existing despite what I'd done, still proving that I hadn't completely broken them. I read every message, never knew how to respond. What could I say that wouldn't sound like excuse or deflection or empty apology? I destroyed parts of their lives. No words could repair that. No amount of remorse could undo it. So I just read their messages and filed them away and continued serving my sentence. 5 years into my imprisonment, the young woman I'd finally learned her name from the tribunal records, though I still think of her primarily as D1893 HA, requested a meeting. The facility allows supervised contact between prisoners and their victims if both parties consented and the counselors deemed it therapeutically appropriate. I didn't want to meet her. Didn't want to sit across from her and see what I'd helped make her become. Me. But I consented anyway, because refusal felt like cowardice, like one more way of hiding from the consequences of my actions. The meeting room was small and quiet, designed for difficult conversations. She sat across the table from me, older now, the naive hope in her eyes replaced by something harder and more knowing. She looked at me for a long time before speaking, I wanted to see you, she said finally, to understand why. Why you did what you did to me. Why you made me betray everyone I knew. Why you looked at me like I was nothing. I told her the truth. That I'd been trained to see subjects as intelligent sources rather than people. Wrong. That I'd learned to suppress recognition of suffering because the work required it. That I'd operated within a system that rewarded efficiency and punished hesitation. That I'd been so thoroughly indoctrinated into Imperial methodology that her terror and desperate cooperation had registered as nothing more than successful technique application. But did you ever see me? She asked. Even for a moment? Did you ever recognize that I was a person? That I was terrified? That I would have told you anything because I just wanted to go home? I told her yes. That I'd seen her gratitude when the session ended. Her naive belief that cooperation had saved her. That I'd known even then that she'd betrayed everyone she knew for nothing. That her future would be labor camps and the weight of her own compliance. And you let me believe anyway, she said. You let me thank you. You let me think I was going to be okay. I had no defense. She was right. I'd seen her hope, and I'd allowed her to keep it, knowing it was false, because correcting her misunderstanding wasn't part of my operational requirements. I hate you, she said, and her voice was steady, matter of fact. I've hated you for years. Hated you more than the Empire, more than the guards in the labor camp, more than anyone else who hurt me. Because you were the one who broke me. You were the one who made me into someone who betrays people. I told her she had every right to hate me, that nothing I'd experienced in prison came close to balancing what I'd done to her, that I understood my sentence was inadequate, and my remorse was meaningless. She sat there for another long moment, studying my face. You're already dead, she said finally. That's what I came to see, whether you were still the person who interrogated me, or whether that person was gone. And you're gone. You're just an empty thing sitting in a cell waiting for your sentence to end. She stood up, preparing to leave. Then she paused. I survived, she said. Despite what you did, despite what they did, despite everything, I survived and I rebuilt my life and I found people I could trust again. It took years and it's still hard, but I did it. So in the end, you didn't win. You didn't break me completely. I'm still here. She left without waiting for a response. The guard escorted her out while I sat there, processing what she'd said. She was right. I was already dead. Had been for years, maybe since the moment I'd looked at the Mon Calamari female and felt something crack inside me. The tribunal and the sentence and the imprisonment were just formalities, procedures applied to someone who'd stopped existing in any meaningful sense long before the Empire fell. But she'd survived, had rebuilt, had found a way to exist beyond what I'd done to her. That should have brought some measure of comfort, some sense that the damage I'd caused wasn't absolutely permanent. Instead, it just made the emptiness heavier, because her survival meant she had to carry the weight of what I'd made her do. Had to live with the knowledge that she'd cooperated, betrayed, chosen her own survival over the safety of everyone she'd known. I'd given her that burden. Along with the terror and the pain and the years in labor camps, I'd given her the permanent weight of her own compliance, and she'd found a way to carry it anyway, to survive despite it, to become someone who could look me in the eye and tell me I'd failed to destroy her completely. The years continued. I served my sentence, participated in the therapeutic programs, maintained model prisoner status. The counselors documented my progress, though I suspect they understood the performance aspect of my cooperation. They were professionals. They'd probably worked with dozens of former interrogators, had developed expertise in recognizing genuine rehabilitation versus learned compliance. They never challenged me on it, though. As long as I caused no problems, completed the required programs, and showed no signs of acute psychological decompensation, they seemed content to let me serve my time quietly. 10 years into my sentence, I received notification that several of the interrogators I'd worked with at Gamma 9 had died in prison. 1 suicide, 2 from medical complications. Aye. 1 killed by another prisoner who'd been a rebel operative during the war and hadn't forgiven the crimes we'd committed. I felt nothing about their deaths. They'd been colleagues, not friends. We'd shared work but not connection. Oh? Their absence from the universe didn't change anything meaningful. 15 years into my sentence, the New Republic began releasing some of the former Imperial personnel who'd served minimum terms and demonstrated successful rehabilitation. Not interrogators, Our sentences were too long, our crimes too severe. But lower-level Imperial staff, bureaucrats and technicians and logistics, personnel who'd enabled the machinery without directly participating in torture or execution. The releases generated controversy. Some people believed any Imperial service should be unforgivable. Others argued that holding people accountable for following orders or performing administrative functions was unjust. The debates played out in the media, in political forums, in public discussions about how to balance justice with reconciliation. I had no opinion. The question of who deserved mercy and who deserved continued punishment felt abstract, disconnected from anything that mattered. The New Republic would make whatever decisions they made based on whatever principles they chose to prioritize. My sentence would continue regardless. 20 years into my sentence, I became eligible for conditional release consideration. A review board would evaluate my rehabilitation progress, psychological state, risk to public safety, and likelihood of successful reintegration into civilian life. The review process took 6 months. Multiple evaluations, interviews, analysis of my behavior, and participation in therapeutic programs, over 2 decades of imprisonment. The board wanted comprehensive understanding before making their determination. I cooperated with the evaluations without expectation. Whether they granted conditional release or required me to serve the full 30 years didn't feel significant. Prison had given my existence structure and purpose. Serving the sentence, following the routines, maintaining compliant behavior. Release would just trade one empty existence for another. The board's decision was delivered in a formal hearing. They acknowledged my cooperation, my lack of disciplinary incidents, my participation in rehabilitation programs. They also noted the severity of my crimes, the number of victims, the systematic nature of my participation in Imperial torture. They denied conditional release, said I could reapply in 5 years, but that current assessment indicated I hadn't achieved sufficient rehabilitation to warrant early sentence completion. The stated reasons were clinical: insufficient emotional processing, limited demonstration of moral reintegration, concerning indicators of dissociative adaptation rather than genuine psychological healing. The unstated reason was simpler. I was still empty, still dead inside. Still, the same hollowed-out thing that had sat in that tribunal courtroom and confessed to torturing 473 people. I returned to my cell and continued my sentence. 25 years into my imprisonment, my medication regimen was changed again. The old compounds had maintained me in a state of functional numbness for decades, but the medical staff believed I needed different intervention, something that might facilitate actual emotional processing rather than just suppressing symptoms. The new medications were destabilizing. Suddenly, things I'd kept carefully sealed began surfacing. Not just memories, I'd lived with those all along, but the full emotional weight of what those memories represented. The faces I'd tried not to see suddenly demanded recognition as people. Individuals with names and histories and connections that had been shattered by what I'd done to them. The young woman who'd thanked me. The Mon Calamari female who'd pitied me. The Rhodian male who'd been my first subject at Gamma 9. Hundreds of others whose names I'd never known, whose processing numbers had been all the identification the Empire required. They were all there, not just as data points or performance metrics, but as human beings I'd systematically destroyed. The weight was crushing. For the first time in decades, I felt something approaching genuine emotion, and what I felt was grief so overwhelming it became physically painful. I spent weeks barely functional, the prison's mental health staff monitoring me for acute psychological crisis, adjusting medications, providing intensive counseling support. Slowly, the crisis passed. The medications stabilized. But something had shifted inside me. The emptiness was still there, but now it was filled with the accumulated weight of all those people. All that suffering, all the harm I'd caused that could never be repaired or undone. The counselor said I was finally processing my trauma, that I was beginning to develop genuine remorse rather than intellectual acknowledgement of wrongdoing, that this was a necessary step toward authentic rehabilitation. Maybe they were right, or maybe this was just another form of the same emptiness, differently configured. I couldn't tell anymore. I completed my 30-year sentence. 30 years for 11 years of torture. The mathematics still felt inadequate, but the tribunal's judgment had been served. On the day of my release, I was given civilian clothing, identification documents, a small amount of credits, and information about reintegration services available to former prisoners. The same process applied to every prisoner completing their sentence, regardless of what crimes had brought them there. I walked out of the correctional facility into a galaxy that had continued evolving while I'd been imprisoned. The New Republic had stabilized, though it faced ongoing challenges from Imperial remnants and new threats. The war crimes tribunals had concluded, their work documented in archives that would ensure future generations understood what the Empire had been. I had nowhere to go. No family, no connections, no place in this galaxy that had moved past the Empire and the war, and the systematic torture that had defined my existence. I found quarters on Chandrila, similar to the ones I'd had on Nar Shaddaa decades ago. Found work in a processing center, loading cargo, the same thoughtless physical labor that required no identity and raised no questions. I existed. Barely. Now, my body continued its biological functions. My mind, such as it was, moved through the routines that gave shape to otherwise formless time. I took my medications, attended mandatory check-ins with my parole supervisor, maintained the minimum requirements for released prisoners serving conditional parole. Sometimes I thought about the young woman who'd visited me in prison, who'd survived despite what I'd done, who'd rebuilt her life and found people to trust and managed to carry the weight of her compliance without being completely destroyed by it. I wondered if I would see her again, if she'd moved past hating me, or if that hatred was something she'd learned to live with, another burden added to all the others. I wondered if she thought about me at all, or if I'd become just another painful memory filed away with all the other painful memories from those years. I wondered if it mattered. Most days I didn't think about the future, didn't make plans or set goals or imagine a life that extended beyond the basic routines of work and medication and parole check-ins. The future was just more time to serve, another form of sentence without defined endpoint. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I would remember the sound of breathing, the particular way it changed when Hope died, the hum of recycled air in interrogation rooms that smelled like fear and ozone. And I would understand that I was still there, in those rooms, would always be there, because that's where I'd left everything that made me human, carved it out piece by piece, session by session, until nothing remained except the machinery. It's 7421. An instrument of Imperial torture. Wah. A designation that had replaced a name I could barely remember. That's what I became. That's what I remain. That's what I will be until this body stops functioning and releases me from the obligation to continue carrying the weight of what I did. The job destroyed me. Destroyed everyone who took it, one way or another. Some died during their service. Some died in prison. Me? Some are still serving their sentences, grinding through decades of detention, trying to find rehabilitation or redemption, or at least the capacity to exist with what they've done. And some, like me, were released into a galaxy that has no place for them, no use for the particular skills they developed, no forgiveness for the crimes they committed in service of an empire that couldn't even maintain its own existence. We, are the remnants, the evidence of what the Empire made of people who volunteered to serve its vision of order. The walking documentation of systematic torture, institutional cruelty, and the complete subordination of individual conscience to operational necessity. We are the answer to the question, what happens to interrogators when the Empire falls? We continue, emptied out, but still functioning, guilty beyond any possible redemption, but still required to keep existing, carrying the weight of hundreds or thousands of faces, voices, moments of suffering that can never be undone or forgotten or forgiven. The machinery broke us just as thoroughly as it broke the subjects we interrogated. Why? But while many of them found ways to survive, to rebuild, to become something beyond what we made them, we remain frozen in the moment of our own breaking. I am 61 years old. My body is deteriorating from decades of stress and medication. My mind, such as it is, knows exactly what I did, remembers every session, carries every face. I will live however many more years this body can sustain, serving an informal life sentence imposed not by the tribunal, but by the weight of my own actions. There is no redemption. No path back to humanity. No amount of time or therapy or remorse that could restore what I carved out of myself in those interrogation rooms. There is only this, the continuation, the breathing that persists, even when hope is gone, the routine that shapes otherwise formless time, the medication that keeps the weight from crushing me completely, and the sound, always the sound, the hum of recycled air, the echo of restrained breathing, the particular noise a body makes when resistance becomes something else entirely. I hear it still, will hear it until I don't hear anything anymore. Why? That's what the job did. That's what it does to everyone who takes it. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, systematically, inevitably. It turns you into an instrument, and instruments don't heal. They just eventually break down, cease functioning, get discarded when their utility is exhausted. I'm waiting for that moment. The breakdown, the cessation. Now, not being able to berate, the end of this extended sentence that started the day I walked into interrogation training and volunteered to become something other than human. Until then, I breathe. I take my medication. I'm well and seguir. I maintain my parole requirements. I exist in this empty space between the person I was and the person I can never become again. It's 7,421. Imperial Interrogator. Non-interrogator or criminal. Empty thing still breathing out of biological habit rather than any actual desire to continue. This is what remains when the machinery finishes its work. This is the true cost of 11 years spent systematically breaking human beings in soundproof rooms on a station orbiting Scarif. This is what happens to interrogators. No, interrogators. We become ghosts. Evidence of crimes that can be documented, but never undone. Warnings to future generations about what happens when individuals surrender their conscience to serve institutions that demand systematic cruelty. We are the cautionary tale, the proof that no one emerges from that work unchanged, that no amount of training or authorization or operational necessity can protect you from what it costs to torture people professionally, methodically, with proper documentation and appropriate protocols. The Empire is gone. The interrogation rooms are closed. The detention centers are empty or converted to other purposes. The machinery has been dismantled. But we remain. No, the people it created, the interrogators it trained and deployed and ultimately abandoned when its own existence became unsustainable. We remain, and we remember, and we carry the weight, and sometimes, in the quiet moments, I hear the sound of breathing that has forgotten how to hope. And I know that sound is my own.